Nietzsche on Socialism, When the Hammer Faces the Sickle. 2020. Introduction. Despite a vast collection on politics, Nietzsche as a political thinker was long neglected, his thoughts on morals and religion always being exalted, but rarely his thoughts on politics. The British philosopher Keith Ansel Pearson, in his work, An Introduction to Nietzsche as Political Thinker, exposes how the German philosopher was ignored in the sphere of political thought for a long time and how he was rescued during the second half of the 20th century. For most of this century, Nietzsche's political thought has been a source of confusion and embarrassment. The consensus which held sway for several decades from the end of the Second World War until quite recently, was that Nietzsche was not a political thinker at all, but someone who was mainly concerned with the fate of the solitary, isolated individual far removed from the cares and concerns of the social world. This view was typical of those, such as the renowned Nietzsche translator and biographer, Walter Kaufmann, who tried to rescue Nietzsche's writings from the abuse they had suffered at the hands of Nazi ideologists and propagandists. However, the result was a dehistoricized and depoliticized interpretation which put a closure on a key aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy, his political thinking. Nietzsche, throughout his works, discusses politics from ancient Greece to his lived time, that is, the second half of the 19th century. The German philosopher studied classical philology, later coming to teach, which perhaps explains his wide knowledge and fascination for classical antiquity, especially the Greek. Nietzsche wrote firm and sometimes harsh thoughts about the politics of his time. Of anti-Semitism, for example, a hot topic in his day, the philosopher wrote that his adherents were scoundrels, that the Germans of his time cultivated anti-Semitic dementia and numerous other criticisms. Nationalism, always condemned in his works, came to be considered a punishment by the philosopher. Another recurring theme from his first works to his last was socialism, and there is still a huge lack of knowledge about Nietzsche's thinking on this subject today, even given its great recurrence. This work comes with the exact intention of bringing together what he wrote on the subject, filling this vacuum in popular knowledge, and clarifying his thinking. To avoid falling into an anachronistic error, it is important to have the historical context in which the philosopher was inserted properly illustrated. In 1864, when Nietzsche was nearing his 20th birthday, the International Working Men's Association, or the First International, as it became popularly known, was founded. It was the first international workers' organization with a completely left-wing bias. From anarchists, like Proudhon and Bakunin, to socialists and communists, like the Onists and Karl Marx. These great figures held several congresses with many debates, often heated debates, mainly from the disagreements between the anarchists and the socialists, which would result in the complete split between the blacks, anarchists, and the reds, socialists, and the consequent dissolution of the organization in 1876. For a long time, it was believed that, despite being a contemporary and fellow countryman of Marx, both born in Prussia, Nietzsche had no knowledge of Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx and the socialism idealized by both because he never mentioned any of them in his works. Indeed, his mentions refer to other socialists, but as Swedish historian Thomas H. Brodger brought to light with his biographical work, Nietzsche's Philosophical Context, an intellectual biography, Nietzsche never mentions Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels, and it is generally assumed that he had no knowledge of them and their kind of thinking and socialism. However, this is not correct. Marx is referred to in at least 11 books, by 9 different authors, that Nietzsche read or possessed. In 6 of them he is discussed and quoted extensively, and in one of them Nietzsche has underlined Marx's name. The 9 authors who mention or discuss Marx, whose works we know that Nietzsche either owned or read, are Georg, Lang, Düring, Meysenbug, Franz, Scheffel, Freyre, Bebel, and Jacobi. Of these, the books by Lang, Düring, Franz, Scheffel, Bebel, and Jacobi contain extensive discussions and long quotations. In 1869, Nietzsche began his work as professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, Switzerland. In 1870, he volunteered as a nurse in the Franco-Prussian War for a few months, before returning to his university due to health problems. From this war there would be two important developments of high impact in European history. With the Prussian victory, the nationalist feeling was emerging among the Germans who allied with Prussia, serving for the creation of the German Empire in 1871, unifying several kingdoms and grand duchies into a single German nation-state. With the French defeat in the war, political instability set in there. The Second French Empire collapsed, giving way to the Third French Republic and the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune, albeit brief, was an experience that would radically impact the thinkers of the time when they saw the first popular socialist experiment being put into practice. Nietzsche did not escape it. He also had his thinking about socialism influenced by the Paris Commune, including citing it throughout his works, as we will see later in this book. The philosopher's first work here, Untimely Meditations, sometimes translated as Unfashionable Observations, was published in 1874, that is, between the experience of the Paris Commune and the end of the First International. Fearing an event similar to the Paris Commune, the German government, under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, passed the so-called anti-socialist laws in 1878, which, after German Emperor Wilhelm I suffered two assassination attempts by anarchists, gained great popularity. With these laws, several restrictions were imposed on socialists, such as prohibition of socialist meeting and to promote their symbols. His second work covered in this book, Human All Too Human, had its first volume originally also published in 1878, the year of the centenary of Voltaire's death, whom Nietzsche called one of the greatest liberators of the spirit, and dedicated the book. In the following year, 1879, the philosopher left the University of Basel and began to live his life as a wanderer, with no fixed home, traveling around Europe. The 1880s were years of great activity, marked the rise of socialism across the continent, consolidating itself as an important political force, more and more, leading workers to large marches and protests, as in the case of the emblematic Bloody Sunday of 1887 in London. During this same period, Nietzsche completed the publication of Human All Too Human with the second part of the second volume in 1880, published Dawn in 1881, The Gay Science in 1882, Beyond Good and Evil in 1886, and Twilight of the Idols in 1888. His last book covered in this work, The Will to Power, is a posthumous book, edited and published by his sister Elizabeth Foster Nietzsche and his friend Peter Gast. The book was first published in 1901, a year after his death, but it was reissued in 1906, expanding from 500 to more than 1,000 aphorisms, all written by Nietzsche in the 1880s. It's important to note that if the German philosopher could have edited the book, not necessarily he would have edited it in the same disposition, with the same content or even with the same title. Given the historical context, I am led to understand that a certain warning must also be given. Reading Nietzsche is certainly not for weak minds. Every word of the German philosopher is so powerful that sounds like a hammer. Those who have a weak mind and a dissonant thought will feel every word like a blow crumbling the foundations of their belief. Those who read it with an open mind have a relief. The complete collapse of the rotten and compromised old building is necessary for the emergence of a solid, firm and strong new building in its place. The end.